Good morning, everyone. My name is Angie Fiesel. I'm the Director of Changemaker Campus with Ashoka U. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session in pursuit of a virtuous cycle for social impact, aligning campus strategy, rankings, accreditation, and recognition. And that's a mouthful to say, but I think it's probably more than a handful to actually accomplish. But we're grateful for an incredible lineup of panelists and moderator today to help us address this topic. One announcement is, unfortunately, Joanne Turbide from HEC Montreal would not be joining us, but we are pleased to have the folks on the line with us today to explore this important topic. As a brief intro to the panel, before I turn it over to our moderator, we have attendees on this call that are both from the General Exchange agenda, as well as the Senior Leaders Experience. For those that were part of the Senior Leaders Experience yesterday, we started with a theme of kind of making sense of our changing landscape. And we really explored what are the internal drivers for change, kind of reconnecting with our purpose, what brought us into higher education, what is the difference that we want to be making, as well as the external drivers. What are some of the trends, including the global pandemic, that are causing us to consider systems change, either currently or for the future? And that leads us to today's session, where we're really going to be looking at some of the systems across our campuses, whether that be strategies, vision, values, whether that be academic models or learning outcomes or student evaluation, or those systems outside of campus, external to the institution, whether that be rankings and accreditation, and thinking about how do we create a virtuous cycle for social impact. It's an important topic for all of us, no matter whether we're a student, an educator, or an administrator. And I'm just really delighted to be able to introduce our moderator for today's session, Craig Dunn. Craig has been with Western Washington University. He is the Wilder Distinguished Professor of Business and Sustainability. And prior to that, he was the Dean of the College of Business and Economics. He's worn lots of different hats: educator, administrator, as well as advisor to business and academic associations. So really looking forward to him being able to draw out the perspectives of our diverse panelists this morning. With that, I'd love to introduce Craig.
Thank you very much, Angie. I'm very delighted to be able to be the moderator for this panel, and wanted to begin by kind of geographically situating myself. I live in Whatcom County, which is where Western Washington University is housed. We are the northwestmost county in the continental United States, which explains the land acknowledgement I'm about to give. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral homes of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in silently expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, or to the indigenous neighbors most relevant to the location in which you are at this moment situated, for their enduring care and protection of what are now our shared lands and waterways. So it strikes me in reading that, we all have different kinds of acknowledgements, and there's a lot of parallels to be made, it seems to me, between the kinds of land acknowledgements that we do and the kind of accreditation standards that we actually engage in. Because one of the lingering questions, and we face this with Ashoka, is how customizable should those acknowledgements be? I'm particularly struck in the language I just read by the reference to shared lands and waterways. And the word shared has so many different dimensions to it, doesn't it? And what does it mean to be shared? Because normally, when we appropriate land through colonial extension and then refer to it as shared, there are all kinds of connotations that might come in that may or may not be appropriate. So I just wanted to suggest that there are some really interesting parallels when we get to this issue of accreditations and rankings, and whether or not there's a one-size-fit-all solution. I don't think there is for land acknowledgements any more than there is for these other ways in which we try to verify quality of our organizations. I was invited to give just a very brief perspective on the role of higher ed, and I'm going to do that by referencing the former president of Western Washington University, Bruce Sheppard, who got pretty grumpy after 2008 when the financial support coming out of our state capital, Olympia, dropped to less than 50%. And he deliberately stopped referring to Western Washington University as a public university. And he referred to us at that point for about 3 or 4 months as publicly supported. And our support from Olympia dropped, as did many public universities' support dropped to about 65% of from 65% to maybe 35% of our total budget. Of course, that was made up in large part by tuition increases. But then I remember that summer, the beginning of our fall quarter, when he gave his convocation address, and he began referring to Western Washington University as a proudly publicly purposed university. And he made the comment at that point that what makes us a public institution is not our source of revenue, but it's our purpose. And that's kind of what we want to talk about here today. What does a virtuous cycle look like? What is the mission and purpose of the university? How do we assure quality in that regard? And I just want to point out, by way of opening, 2 things that I think are very difficult for us to ignore. And that is that there, at least in many of the universities that are represented here, whether by the panelists or by the audience members, we're embedded in systems that place a high value on both the institutions of democracy and free market capitalism. What those 2 institutions share in common is a value for personal liberty and personal choice that gets expressed in a variety of ways. And so when I think about the purpose of a university, whether it's public or private, what strikes me above all else is that we can't have effective, smoothly functioning democracies or capitalist systems without having an educated populace. When people walk into a voting booth and they make a choice, or they walk into a store and they make a choice, those choices could be informed by things that are fairly pedestrian, like the price and quality of the product, or whether the candidate for office is a Democrat or a Republican in the case of the United States. Or they could make much more sophisticated choices. What is the candidate for public office position about whether or not public education or healthcare is a public good or a private good? Or what are their concerns about social justice? Or when making purchases in stores, if it's not just about price and quality, is it about something that's more, dare we say, liberal arts-based, about social justice and about the livelihoods and living standards of those who are manufacturing the goods that we purchase or delivering the services that we're availing ourselves of? So I think that sets just a little context. In the panel, we explore 4 different perspectives: the educator perspective, the administrator perspective, the community engagement thought leader perspective, and accreditation thought leader perspective, in the context of the role of the university in relation to societal challenges and those implications for education, operations, reporting, accreditation rankings, and impact. And of course, we really want to focus on social impact as much as we can in this. So we have some great panelists here. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves now and respond to the following. So first, for each of you, and we'll start with you, Jay, we're interested in having you outline for us the role you play within your institution. And for you, I also would like you to give just a bit of background because you come from industry. So you're not fully explained by your role in the institution, and how your work in your current role is contributing to your institution's societal impact. And then beyond the current coronavirus crisis, what do you see as driving change in higher education in general? And what opportunities, not so much challenges, but what opportunities do such drivers represent? So Jay, please introduce yourself to us.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks everyone for being here. So a couple of things, as Craig alluded, I did not take a conventional path into higher ed. I was in the private sector and then moved into higher ed first as an adjunct faculty, and now in my present role as the Sharp McNally Chair of Green and Socially Responsible Business. And I came out of the natural and organic foods industry as well as consulting to Fortune 100 companies. So really for the last several decades, I've been on a journey to create social and environmental change through commerce and action. And for those of you who aren't familiar with College of the Atlantic, we are an intentionally small school off the coast of Maine. We've been the top ranked school for amongst all colleges and universities for sustainability for the last 4 years from the Princeton Review. And in many ways, College of the Atlantic was designed to push the envelope on higher ed. And so my role there right now, my formal title is the Sharp McNally Chair of Green and Socially Responsible Business. But really, I see my role in 2 areas. The first is, how do you remake higher ed writ large so that students can merge their interests and education to change the world? And so this is not about just churning out ventures, but what this is really about is deepening and expanding the educational experience and giving students the opportunity to dive deeper into their coursework because it has personal meaning for them. And then the other area of my work is really how can you incorporate the UN Sustainable Development Goals into curriculum and research to increase impact. And I'll get into some of the specifics of how we do this later with different programs we run. I think the other thing that is very interesting is our work has clearly had some resonance. And I've been doing consulting in about 15 different countries with universities that are up to 100 times the size of College of the Atlantic. And we have been working with universities all across the world, as far apart as Greenland, the US, Mexico, Australia, Japan, and to name a few places. And then to your final question, Craig, of how are things changing? I think the value proposition for a university has really changed. And what students are demanding now is that the classroom and their lives should not be separate entities. And in fact, we need to think about ways and create ways to bring those 2 things together so the education has more meaning, more engagement, and bring student learning to a higher level. And that's some of the work I've been doing both at College of the Atlantic and internationally. So great to be here. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that self-introduction. I'm going to move on to Matthew and ask you the same question. I'm hesitating to actually give your current titles only because I just don't think that actually fully captures who you are as a person, and you haven't had a very linear trajectory either. So again, for you, in the role that you're currently in, but perhaps a little background behind that, how is your work contributing to the institution's social impact? And then leaving aside for the moment the current coronavirus crisis, what do you see as driving change in higher education in general, and what opportunities are associated with those?
Thanks, Craig. So I am Matthew Johnson. I'm the institutional role I'm going to speak mostly from today is as the director of the Carnegie Classification for Community Engagement. I have, though, spent the last 5 years as the executive director of the Howard R. Swearer Center for Public Service at Brown. So I've had the practical side of working to build programs and educate students and provide the opportunities that are similar to the types of things Jay has been doing so well around the world, but also now have been in the role of directing the Carnegie Classification for Community Engagement for the last few years. The classification is a process of self-study, really, more than anything, that encourages campuses to go through 12 to 18 months of deep self-study to discover where in their institution community engagement may be happening, to really sharpen with some rigor their understanding of community engagement as something related to but different from community service or service learning or even community involvement. It actually has a pretty clear and particular definition. I think that the framework has really driven transformation across higher ed for the last 15 years. We just did a sample study of conference programs over that period across many of the higher education conferences. And the themes and issues identified in the classification are replete across those programs for concurrent sessions and plenary speakers and the like. We just completed the 2020 cycle and announced the new classified schools in January. And so it's really a process of self-study that can lead to acknowledgement by the foundation of being an institution who's doing community engagement at an exemplary level. In response to your second question about where I think higher education is going today, I think we're at a pivotal moment, actually. I think if you read Inside Higher Ed this morning, there was actually quite a good article about the turn that the University of Michigan is making right at this moment towards public engagement, publicly engaged scholarship, and the like, very intentionally making that turn under the leadership of Mark Schissel there. In the media more recently, you saw the turn that Tufts has done to sort of turn the campus over to respond to the moment. At the same time, many institutions are doing the opposite. They're pulling back from their public commitments. They're being much more conservative. They're trimming the very sorts of things that we care about on this webinar, retreating from the public realm and focusing even more squarely on the other piece of the trend that I see happening, which is a push towards responding to short-term market demands for job readiness, skill training, really to create widgets for the economy in some ways, rather than the more broad understanding of education that grounds the American higher education system as quite different than its predecessors in Europe, for example. The public purpose of higher education has always been at the root of the American style of higher education. And as we stray from that and focus more tightly and in a more short-term way to responding to market demands, we miss some of that role that Craig mentioned of preparing a well-prepared democratic populace for a vibrant democracy. The community engagement classification is the only elective classification of the foundation. We are building new ones. There will be one that starts next year around leadership for public purpose. And we have on the drawing board others around local economic development and a few others. The idea here is to push back, frankly, against the ranking systems and say, wait a second, there's another piece, there's another role of higher education institutions in our society. And we want to offer an alternative to the ranking systems, which are mostly market-driven.
Great, thank you so much, Matthew. As Dean for 3 years of the College of Business and Economics, I certainly felt some of the pressures that you've described, but also have been delighted that AACSB, we use all these acronyms, not everyone knows what they stand for, the Association for the Advancement of Collegiate Schools of Business. Did I get that right? You need to unmute yourself, Julia.
Yes, that's right. That's correct.
So, I've been delighted that what's driving accreditation standards with AACSB right now is organized around 3 threads of innovation, impact, and here's the word again, engagement. And so one thing that I recognized years ago is there's a great synergy between the kinds of rankings and accreditation standards and the work that we're asked to do at universities in terms of justifying our existence when it comes to things such as actually contributing to the betterment of society. And by the way, Ashok has done wonderful work in that regard as well, is trying to document what innovation, engagement, impact, mostly impact actually mean when it comes to societal impact, rather than the way we used to do it, which was, let's count how many citations an article for a professor at a particular university has. And I think that's one of the tendencies we've had, is to measure those things that are easiest to measure. We do it with generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. We do it in a lot of different dimensions. But AACSB, I think, is moving beyond that. Can you describe for us your current role as well, and then what you see as driving change in higher ed besides AACSB? And though I think you are a driver for change, and what opportunities does that present?
Sure. Well, thank you. have been at AACSB for 15 or so years. My roots are working on our accreditation team, but for many years now I've been working with our business education intelligence team, which focuses on the landscape of business education and higher education more broadly. So we try to bring those insights into the organizational strategy and then bring them to our membership as well. For many years now, I've worked with our innovation committee. And I bring that up because in 2016, that committee published a collective vision for business education, outlining 5 opportunities for business schools that really have driven a lot of what we focused on at AACSB in the last couple of years. They are overarching opportunities for business schools that transcend the specific missions or contexts that a school might find itself in, being catalysts for innovation, hubs of lifelong learning, leaders in leadership development, co-creators of knowledge. And the last one is enablers of global prosperity. And that one in particular has been a major inspiration in the crafting of the proposed new accreditation standards that will get voted on by our membership next week. It's one of those themes that appears throughout the standards, and one that we're really excited about and that we've gotten a lot of great feedback and attention to from across our membership. I think that idea of being an enabler of global prosperity or of having a positive societal impact really drives back to one of the main catalysts for change in higher education today, which is that theme of relevance. It's something that we see in the way we've shifted our approach to assurance of learning. How do you identify relevant competencies? Well, in the past, assurance of learning, at least for AACSB, was fairly focused on direct measures, which limited competency identification to those specific competencies which could be most easily directly measured. We've now shifted towards allowing for more indirect measures to free up schools to be more relevant and intentional with the competencies that they're defining in partnership with their stakeholders. Another is in knowledge creation or co-creation. Craig, as you mentioned, shifting the attention from simply counting outputs to focusing on the impacts that those outputs can have. And in particular, looking for evidence of co-creation with business practice or with other disciplines in the process. I think there is certainly a lot of pressure on schools today from different directions, rankings being one of them. Accreditation, potentially another, but we hope that the flexible mission-centric approach applied by AACSB allows schools to look hard at what their clarity of purpose is for the stakeholders that they serve and develop their program offerings accordingly.
So is it still the case that roughly 5% of the business schools around the world are accredited by AACSB?
Well, the figure refers to the number, or the denominator in that is the number of business degree granting institutions. So not all of those are at the level of formality organizationally that we might tend to think of when we talk about a business school. But it is a small proportion, and that's because in part, our standards are intended for universities or schools of business that have a research mission. It's not intended to be a one-size-fits-all model of accreditation or quality assurance for every business school around the world.
So I think both with the rankings and with accreditation, what we see is these are really rigorous standards that really end up netting a very small subset of higher ed institutions that they catch in their net. Jay, I'm going to come back to you for the second question because I know how student focused you are, and I appreciate your comments as well as yours, well, both Matthew and Julianne, about co-creating education. And I know, Jay, you really implement that in so many ways. When I think about the role of traditional religious institutions and how they define their purpose, I'm educated but not necessarily committed to those views. But I find it interesting that they describe themselves as being defined by, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Catholic tradition in particular, as focused on the word and liturgy and tradition and then experience. And I think that's what you were saying, Jay, that students are really demanding now that their experience has a role to play, a legitimate role to play in higher ed. So the first question is, how do you see the drive for rankings and accreditation influencing the strategic direction of universities? That is not just colleges, but universities as a whole. And then what factors are influencing shifts in student learning outcomes or other shifts in pedagogy and or evaluation? And you're at a university, so how are those impacting the work you do related to higher education? And then what other stakeholders need to be involved in order for us to be effective in higher ed? Lots of questions.
Yeah, that's a whole bunch of questions. I think I may take it from the student, start with the students and work back. And Craig, you may have to remind me of some of the other pieces of this if I'm not hitting them all. But from what I see from students on a daily basis, and I should start by saying at College of the Atlantic, like we pride ourselves on in-person education, and so we moved entirely online. And what I've been really happy to see is that the educational outcomes that students are seeking haven't really changed. It's just the delivery methodology that's changed. And so what I think more and more what students are demanding is the so what of education. And it used to be good enough, and I think it still has a lot of merit to just say, no, you just need to be educated. But they also are demanding that there is some connection between what they're learning and how they can use it, which I think is pushing educators to take their ideas farther and to just get out of, to still, theory is still incredibly important. And when you merge that theory with the experience that you're talking about, Craig, it just brings things up to a higher level. So I see students, especially now with coronavirus and in the US context where they're paying a lot of money to go to the various institutions, and they are concerned about what is the payback, and not that they need to come out. And Matthew, I think your point was really well taken. This is not about just training someone to do a specific job, but it's also having them leave a university being able to talk about, here's what I learned, and here's what I did, and here's how they come together. And I have, I'm reading original research because this was for a project I was interested in doing in class, or because I started out with a particular experience, and then suddenly realized that, wow, I could plumb the depths of this so much farther. So I think, that is really the piece that's coming down from the students. And then I think to go to like the rankings and accreditation, I mean, hearing what AACSB is doing is really refreshing, because I think too many both rankings and accreditation organizations, they want to measure, as you talked about, Craig, what is easiest to measure. And that tends to put people in really neat little boxes and consequently tends to squelch innovation. And I think, part of what I see at universities where senior administrators can really help is creating some of these opportunities and creating a little elbow room for people to explore. And I think we'll touch more on that later, but I think there needs to be more thought around rankings of the kind that's being described by AACSB or accreditation, or different ways of thinking about what we're doing, because I think we're more and more getting pigeonholed, and that's really not good for the students. It's not good for the faculty, and it's really reducing, I would say, educational outcomes. So Craig, I may leave it there. I think you may have had one more, but I want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to weigh in.
No, that was perfect, Jay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think we'll move to you, Julianne, since you do represent, like it or not, an accrediting body. You must like it because you're there. But it is interesting for me to know from your perspective, what do you see the role of AACSB and other similar kinds of accreditation bodies having in setting or influencing the strategic direction of universities? I mean, I think that's absolutely key. And how do you see your role in also influencing student learning outcomes?
Yeah, well, the strategic direction is really the starting point for everything that a school ultimately gets assessed on in the process of an accreditation review. So throughout the number one standard is about the mission and strategic priorities and the strategic planning processes of the school. And then every other standard that follows refers back to assessing the school on those other dimensions in alignment with that mission and set of priorities. We similarly would expect that schools would have different metrics of success. So if we look at rankings, for example, a common metric is starting salary of graduates. But we would expect that might not be an appropriate metric for schools that are putting graduates in different industries. Certainly not a school that's got a heavy entrepreneurship focus and is graduating individuals to go into startups. To apply a single metric across every institution that's accredited would be pushing them in directions that are not well aligned with what they have been created and what they exist to do for their communities. So that's really important for us to make sure that we have standards that are cultivating diversity instead of stifling that. And that's why I find it such an enjoyable place to work, because we do get to see the richness of the ways in which schools differ from one another in what they do and the intentionality behind that. With competencies and assurance of learning, I find that also a very interesting area these days. I'll give a quick example that highlights that. We just did a survey of on leadership development practices among business schools and talent development leaders. We did this in partnership with SHRM. And
is that the Society
when we asked about
the,
I'm sorry, we did this with the Society for Human Resource Managers. Mm-hmm. And we asked about the competencies that they each associate with leadership development. And we saw differences there, where business schools were more likely to mention things like a global mindset, strategic management, diversity and inclusion, some of the things that we might tend to lump together under soft skills. Whereas on the business side, we saw a lot more emphasis on operational knowledge, specific business acumen, like financial strategies, and the like. So what we don't know about that is there just a disconnect in language, or is there truly a difference of expectation? And I think often what happens when we start talking about competencies or learning goals, we're drilling down to a single word. And in doing so, we lose a lot of the context of what's really meant and what's really expected there. I think that's one of our big challenges when it comes to assurance of learning and identifying those competencies.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. And Matthew, in your role, current role, how do you see yourself as either influencing or not the strategic direction of universities? I assume that that's part of your mission, and also student learning outcomes.
Yeah, it certainly is. I think I really appreciate some of what Julianne has said and have been an admirer of ACSB because of some of the things she said, and they mirror some of the approaches that the Carnegie classification has taken from the beginning. namely that it is flexible enough to be achieved by any institution, from a community college to an R1. We are trying to value the diversity of different types of institutions, and embedded in that is a notion that the institutional mission ought to be about community engagement, and we then look to see through the process of self-study where that is made manifest pervasively and deeply across the institution. The second piece of the framework is really about assuring continuous improvement over time. And so as we look at things like asking the institution how it knows that it's doing a good job in the community, what evidence does it collect? How does it use that evidence to make decisions about reorienting or continuing along the path it is laying for itself? We also ask questions about student learning outcomes. How are they framed? How are they articulated and shared across the institution? How do you know whether or not you're attending to, in the programming that you're offering, the achievement of those learning outcomes? And how are you using the data that you're collecting in assessing that to make wise decisions moving forward in a continuous improvement process? And the beauty of that system that is flexible for all types of institutions, but is also accountable in a continuous improvement way, is that it becomes an engine for innovation. We discover in every cycle new practices that institutions have developed that are promising and sometimes very powerful. And we discover that old practices that have been around in the field for a while really haven't borne out in maybe 5 years of assessment data. And so an institution is abandoning that for something new. And so that valuing of diversity of practice inside a process of continuous improvement, I think, is really important along the way. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that while we think about diversity of institution type, I think we also need to think about how engagement is in some ways brought to the fore by the diversification of the people inside of our institutions. As folks who previously were not welcome in our institutions from historically underrepresented backgrounds across the 90s and early 2000s began to reach a critical mass inside of our institutions, they began to ask really important questions about the epistemological foundations of higher education, this expert model that claims that all knowledge comes from inside the academy, and problematize that in really important ways. And I think engagement is a vehicle for discovery, for discovering that people outside the academy are just as important to the knowledge creation process, and that the real problems that we need to address moving forward are most efficiently and effectively addressed when we do co-creation of knowledge, to return to that word again. Mm-hmm. So I think that those are the things that are important to us and that I think are shared across the panelists here today.
Yeah, well, I think that was a great summation of some history of thought. When we draw distinctions between ontology, that is, what is the nature of truth, and epistemology, how do we know truth? And you're suggesting that the participation of students in this co-creation process should be a legitimate part of epistemology. I think that's a refreshing perspective. I'm going to combine the last two questions because I'm very committed to leaving time for, it's not just Q&A, but comment as well. And I do know that we have some senior administrators that are in the room, so to speak. So the question is, and I'm going to stay with you, Matthew, for this to start. If you had the ear of senior administrators in higher education, which you do at this point in time, because they're in the room, what recommendations would you offer in terms of, and here's the key, practical tips and or tools that can be offered at this time with an eye toward maintaining and amplifying the social impact of our work?
Yeah, this is actually a really easy answer. And the senior administrators will sometimes respond to this answer by saying, oh, that's not my responsibility. It resides within departments. That's what I hear frequently. But really, I think the answer is open your tenure and promotion processes to value this kind of work so that faculty can engage not only their students as co-creators, but community members as co-creators, folks outside the academy as co-creators, and allow for and create new pathways for those faculty to do that experimentation with knowledge. You know, it's not coincidental that as the young professoriate has diversified and more folks from historically underrepresented groups have come into the academy as intellectuals, they are struggling with the tenure and promotion standards, in part because this is the type of scholarly work they want to do most. And so they are leaving higher education at disproportionate rates to go and do the same kind of high quality scholarly work in nonprofits and foundations instead of the academy. So that's my answer, is open your tenure and promotion standards to include and value engaged scholarship.
And I think that's a good answer. And I understand why sometimes that gets pushed off to departments because they have their own unit evaluation plan. But we've made changes that are more far-reaching and university-wide. For example, in the research category, including an acknowledgement that theater and dance and art should be able to include performance as part of the process, as opposed to just published research that's more traditional in form. And I think that's an analog that you're advocating. Let's extend that even further. Jay, what would your response be to practical tips and tools that we might give to senior administrators in terms of amplifying social impact?
Yeah, so I'd like to start. I agree completely with what Matthew just said. I'm not going to restate it because I think it was very eloquent, but I couldn't agree more. I think another area to really look at is opportunities to merge curricular and co-curricular, what have traditionally been considered co-curricular activities. You think of curricular, we value those things. We offer academic credit to signify that. And yet many students are most engaged in the co-curricular activities, working out in the community, venture incubators and things of the like. And basically, if you really break it down, most students are doing those despite their formal education. And yet those remain some of the most impactful things that they'll do while they're in university. And so, for example, and just a quick example of this, at College of the Atlantic, our sustainable venture incubator is offered for a full term's worth of credit. And so we have students who are starting enterprises for credit. And the point here, again, is not about churning out enterprises. It's to allow students to experience the entrepreneurial process and delve deeply into an issue they care about. And so, yes, while we've had students do everything from start over 24 schools in Nepal as part of this process, to work on biofuel companies and start schools, the really important piece of this and the success of it is understanding how do you go about doing these things, and then how do you further your education. And we see all the time that is crucial for us to bring students up to the next level of learning. And understanding why these ideas are so important and why their education is relevant.
So for that work you just described, Jay, are the students getting academic credit?
Yeah, so for the students in our venture incubator program called the Hatchery, it's the only class they take. It's worth a full term of academic credit. So it's really seen as a capstone experience where they can pull together all of their knowledge from, and we're an interdisciplinary school. So this is for students all across the curriculum. So we'll have an artist next to a scientist, next to someone who wants to start a community organization, all working to start their ventures. And in that role, success is not necessarily starting the venture and continuing on. It could be understanding why the venture won't work and choosing to abandon it. But yeah, it's worth a full term's worth of academic credit. And as well, we have many classes where students are engaged in outside projects as part of their coursework. And so just removing those barriers has been really key to getting the mind share from students to make things happen.
Thanks, Jay. And Julianne, I know that in the work you're doing with AACSB, the focus on engagement and impact is something that you're requiring your participating universities of higher ed to actually measure. Beyond that, what are the other kind of practical tips and tools that you've seen work in these different contexts?
Well, I think, again, being laser focused on mission and purpose. There's so many distractions out there pull attention away towards other, quite valuable objectives. But leave that for another school to focus on. I would say also that we can use what's happening today to help question where those false barriers are. 6 months ago, less than 10% of business programs were delivered fully online. And now suddenly, over a matter of days or weeks, that's 100%. Maybe not optimal for all of them, and it won't stay that way, but it does show what a sense of urgency can make happen when that's needed. So certainly questioning those false assumptions. And the last thing I would mention is referencing something Matthew mentioned earlier about the diversity of participants. I think as we talk about societal impact, often sustainable development goals, as Jay mentioned, get brought into that conversation, and it's important that they do. But that doesn't mean that every school or university needs to feel like it needs to go out and single-handedly solve clean water or come up with a solution on another goal. If we think about the role of universities in preparing diverse individuals who approach problems differently to go out and be leaders within their organizations, to be co-creating solutions with other researchers for those challenges, that's a really important role for universities to be playing in having societal impact. It's more indirect, but it's essential. We shouldn't underestimate or undercount that.
So I'd like to comment on this question as well, and also invite those of you who are in the audience to submit questions or comments through the Q&A. There is one question or request for comment in there now, but we could certainly field more than that. One thing that I'm very struck with over the last decade is the different pressures on students' time. And I'll give you a very specific example about our students have been committed for a few decades now to taxing themselves. And they now call it the Sustainability Equity Justice Fund. And it generates about $400,000 a year. If you back up the clock 2 or 3 years ago, what we were finding is that pool of money continued to grow, but students weren't applying for it because it was a grant-based process. And they could do demonstration projects of a variety of kinds. So the ones that are underway right now are an anaerobic digester for campus, feminine hygiene products in the restrooms. I mean, there's just a full range of products and activities. But the reason that the shift was made is because faculty, such as myself, have required that students apply for that funding as part of a course. In this case, it's an introductory course in business and sustainability. So the project has to relate to business and sustainability in some way. But now the money is actually overspent, which I think is a good problem to have. But the point I want to make is it's unreasonable to ask a student who's had their tuition double over the last decade, not them in particular, but as a group, who sometimes they're food insecure, they're having to work more in order to pay for their tuition dollars, they're incurring a greater student debt load upon graduation, and then to ask them to do something that's outside the credit-bearing activity of the university just seems to me unreasonable. And it also diminishes the quality or the expectation about learning that's attached to that activity. When we build it in to actually the academic pursuit of the university, I think it actually gives it a lot more credibility and legitimacy. And so that's a tip that we could do. Like, let's fold this in. Let's structurally, as senior administrators, think about, I'll just use the example of the Office of Sustainability at Western Washington University. We have 5 divisions, one of which is Business and Financial Affairs. The Office of Sustainability used to reside there because their focus was on greening the university grounds and buildings. But when we moved that office into the Office of Academic Affairs, then we established for that office an entirely different dimension of activity that was grounded in student learning outcomes. And then you can build that into the curriculum in ways that actually bear credit for students, which I think makes a lot of sense. So the question that was posed in Q&A so far has to do with the Times Higher Ed University Impact Ranking, and if any of the panelists have experience or an opinion about that ranking.
I did a little bit of work when I was in Australia, because schools were very the school I was working with was very interested in that ranking system, and if it's the one I'm recalling, was really focused on the UN SDGs, and so but again, it relied, if I remember correctly, it was also going back to the traditional metrics around papers and other things. So I think it was a good. I liked that it was looking for new measures, but it was looking for new things to be interested in around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But what was a little distressing, it was still going back to those same metrics of like, how many peer-reviewed articles do you have and other things. And then valuing some of the other pieces that we've been talking about a little less. And if I could veer slightly, Craig, I think on what you just spoke about, I think is really important. There are learning opportunities in almost every functioning area of campus, and bringing getting rid of those walls between, this is in academia and this is in the outside world or in the outside campus. And the more we can do to eliminate that, I think the further you can take things, either, through the tenure process or through rankings. And the professors and students are, by what I've seen in all of these different universities I've worked with, are incredibly excited to do this. And sometimes it can feel like, oh, if I don't make a wholesale change, I don't have any progress. So I think you need to be working towards what Matthew was talking about, or some of the examples like you and I have been talking about. That said, you can do a lot of small things to just allow for experimentation and mergers of theory and practice and co-creation in courses. And a lot of them, when I go and actually talk to folks in universities, they're already happening because people are doing them under the radar. What we need to do is elevate them, and so figure out what's going on and take those initiatives that are already happening and elevate them so they can have some of the recognition and status.
So I see there was a chat comment about that.
So I'd be happy to talk more about the experience supported. So the question is, could I talk more about the experience in supporting a student who starts their own journey as an entrepreneur at the university? How do you encourage and support it? And if there's a focus for specific business impact. So I should mention, in the hatchery, which is our venture incubator, I would say approximately half of the students who enter in have never ever taken a business course. And so I think the biggest thing is we're also an interdisciplinary university. So you get people coming at enterprises from all directions. And what oftentimes happens, students realize that, oh, wow, I actually want to do this for my life. Or at least I think I do. And then that's when they suddenly start to search for business skills. So what I do is I make it as easy as possible for students to have multiple points of entry. Some is around finding solutions in social impact. Another might be a course on failure and just how do you think about that? Another one is a course on sustainable strategies, where you will consult with a for or nonprofit organization or startup and see how they do things. And so I'm all about meeting students where they are. And if a student comes into the hatchery and they have this much experience and they're at this level, we can take them to here. And if they're more advanced up here, we can bring them up to the next level. So I think it's really about reducing the number of roadblocks and making it easy for students to enter. And so it is really, one of my, I know I'm doing my job well when I have a student who comes into a course and says, I really don't like business and I have no interest in it. But I want to take a course because I think it's important and I want to get these things done. So I realize I might need it at some point. But if you are willing to enter a course, even though you're hostile to some of the ideas in it, then you're making some progress.
And I think that's great. Julianne, a quick question for you. We don't have any other questions in our Q&A, but I wanted to get kind of your perspective as someone at AACSB, and I'll just say at an accreditation body in general. I think one of the tensions that we feel as a university is the easiest thing for us to do, the easiest thing for us to measure our student learning outcomes based on course embedded measures, because we've already done the work of evaluating students around oral presentation or writing skills or mastery of accounting concepts, whatever it happens to be. And yet what's being described here is perhaps looking at measures that don't necessarily relate to course embedded content. And how receptive do you see accrediting bodies being to trying to justify student learning based on something other than course embedded measures, which are staid and traditional and don't capture the kinds of social impacts that matter most to us?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak to all accrediting bodies. I can just speak to AACSB. But that is, I think, a big shift for us in the proposed standards that we're hoping to have in place into the next year. And I think that's reflective of what some of the other panelists were commenting on about the importance of a holistic learning experience, not tied exclusively to classes, but one that includes those co-curricular experiences as well, so that the goal is to educate the individual, to create new experiences and develop new perspectives, and not to limit that learning to a set of bullets in a syllabus.
Right.
So that's the spirit behind the shift, as well as to not create artificial constraints on identifying what those learning objectives are, simply because they can be most easily measured within the confines of a course.
Do you have a 30-second comment, Matthew? Or not?
I'm not going to repeat what's already been said by my erstwhile colleagues. I think this has been a great conversation.
And I appreciate the panelists completely. I mean, this has been great for me too. And you know, one of my objectives was that we could operate at a 30,000-foot level, but also leave behind some practical tips for the people in the room. And I hope that that's happened. I wanted to leave Angie just a few minutes for a wrap up and also a survey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Really thought-provoking. I think we came into this questioning what systems need to be changed. And I think you've given us a lot of fodder, whether that's education that's more integrated and connected, and for the so what from Jay, or whether that's, you know, broader definitions of standards and learning outcomes from Julianne that appreciate greater diversity, being mindful of what we measure, but making sure that that's broad enough and appropriate enough to achieve social impact, innovation, and engagement. And Matthew as well, just really reiterating the role of the university in engagement, and that co-creation of knowledge is where we will find the richest resources in the end, and that needs to be a core priority underpinning all. I think that's given us motivation to look at how we both educate, how we measure, how we do faculty tenure and promotions as well. I'm going to just close with a quick poll as well. We would love to just get your feedback really quickly as a result of this panel. And as you're taking a look at that and completing that, just to give you a heads up of what's next. So the next session starts at 12:30 Eastern time. It's an exchange session, it's a keynote, and it's what the world needs is love, change making across differences and divisive times. And I'm also excited that we're going to be designating HEC Montreal as the newest Ashoka U Changemaker campus. So hopefully that you all can join us to that session. Thank you so much for your time. And if you would just continue to complete that poll. And then as we do so, we'll be closing out. See you this afternoon. So a lot of change that's about to be happening on campus. Excited to hear what that's going to be. We see change across the board, a blend, but maybe leaning in a little bit more towards evaluation and external recognitions. Internal systems, most concerned about student assessment. Really think we hit that towards the end, which kind of integrated across the opening comments of even the student engagement process. And finally, which external systems? Wow, we've got a whole grouping there. Thank you all so much. We'll see you hopefully at the keynote or this afternoon. Take care.